Hey, I'm back. Continuing now from where I left off, we are on Book 2, Part 1, or Section 1, I guess they call it. There is only one part, I guess. Book 2, Part 1, and we're on Chapter 2, the Doctrine of the Revelation Regarding Man, or Christian Anthropology. 1. The Nature of Man. Section 13, the origin of the first human pair and the unity of the human race. 1. The origin of the first man. And here we have a dogma. The first man was created by God. That's a de fide dogma. The first man was created by God. Surprise, surprise. The Fourth Lateran and the Vatican Council declared the creative deed by which God called the first man into existence is to be conceived in regard to the soul as creatio prima, in regard to the body as creatio secunda. So I guess, should I read the Latin? I guess I will, why not? The Fourth Lateran Council and the Vatican Council declared utramque de nihilo conditit creaturam spiritualem et corporalem, ac deinde humanam quasi communem ex spiritu et corpore constituam. The creative deed by which God called the first man into existence is to be conceived in regard to the soul as creatio prima, as in regard to the body as creatio secunda. The materialistic theory of evolution, according to which man, as to his whole being, both body and soul, developed mechanically from the animal kingdom, is to be rejected. Of course it is. The soul of the first man was created immediately by God out of nothing. As regards the body, its immediate formation from inorganic stuff by God cannot be maintained with certainty. That's putting it mildly. Fundamentally, the possibility exists that God breathed the spiritual soul into an organic stuff, that is, into an originally animal body. Really? I don't think that possibility exists. In fact, noteworthy, even if not absolutely decisive, paleontological and biological grounds seem to point to a genetic connection between the human body and the highest forms of the animal kingdom. Well, yeah, they have a common designer. So they have common design elements. So I disagree with Ott and his assessment of theistic evolution, special transformism. I think it's nonsense. Anyway, the encyclical Humani Generis of Pope Pius XII in 1950 lays down that the question of the origin of the human body is open to free research by natural scientists and theologians. He insists on the careful weighing of the pros and cons of the grounds for its origination from an already living material, and warns the faithful against the assumption that discoveries up to the present determine and prove the origin of the human body from an organic stuff, and points out that in this question the need for the greatest reserve and care emerges from the sources of revelation. Yeah, I've read the document in question, Humani Generis, and it's a very, very restricted freedom that it gives for special transformism, the examining both sides of that question and not taking it for granted. Holy Writ contains a double account of the creation of the first man. Genesis 1:27 says, quote, God created man to his own image. To the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Gender theory is a bunch of nonsense too. I don't want to get into gender theory here, but continuing, Genesis 2:7 says, quote, and the Lord formed man out of the slime of the earth and breathed into his face the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So the slime of the earth is not living matter, right? I have no problem if God wanted to use the slime of the earth and He created the body out of that. God can do whatever he wants, but to say that we evolved from apes is a complete insult to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ did not evolve from apes, sorry to tell you. According to the immediate literal sense, God created the body of the first man immediately out of inorganic material from the slime of the earth, and vivified it by breathing it into it a spiritual soul. The idea that the spiritual soul was created in an animal body is foreign to the letter of Holy Writ, amen, and to the fathers. The question of the descent of the human body from the animal kingdom first appeared under the influence of the modern theory of evolution, which is complete BS. The biblical text does not exclude this theory. What? I think it does. Just as in the account of the creation of the world, one can, in the account of the creation of man, distinguish between the per se inspired religious truth that man, both body and soul, was created by God, and the per accidens inspired, stark anthropomorphistic representation of the mode and manner of the creation. While a fact of the creation of man by God in the literal sense must be closely adhered to in the question as to the mode and the manner of the formation of the human body, an interpretation which diverges from the strictly literal sense is, on weighty grounds, permissible. I agree with that. According to Genesis 2:21 and following, the body of the first woman was formed from the body of the first man. Yes, Genesis 2:22 reads, quote, "And the Lord built the rib which he took from Adam into a woman," end quote. This account, which is starkly anthropomorphistic, was understood by the generality of the fathers in the literal sense. By individual fathers and theologians, it was allegorically interpreted. The Alexandrians, Cajetan, Lagrange, or explained as a vision in the case of Hummelauer, Holberg. According to a decision of the Bible Commission, the literal historical sense is to be adhered to in regard to the formation of the first woman out of the first man. Boom. Mic drop. Compare Ecclesiasticus 17:5, which reads, quote, "Out of him he created a helper similar to him," end quote. 1 Corinthians 11:8 says, "The woman is of the man." Quote, "The woman is of the man," end quote. However, the saying is and remains mysterious. Of course, it's mysterious. The fathers concur in teaching that God immediately created the first man, both as to body and soul. They see symbolized in the manner of Eve's creation the essential assimilation of the woman to man, the divine inauguration of marriage, and the origin of the church and of the sacraments from the wound in the side of Christ, the second Adam. Compare St. Augustine, his works on the letters of John, or whatever that is. 2. The unity of the human race. And here we have a dogma. The whole human race stems from one single human pair. This is a Cent Certa dogma. The whole human race stems from one single human pair. So if you want to call yourself a theistic evolutionist and you start talking about some gradual, very gradual, almost imperceptible difference between the apes and their human offspring, and that it's an ongoing statistical thing where no single human pair ever emerged as distinct from their bestial parents, then you've strayed from the dogmas of the church. Sorry to tell you. Okay. The whole human race stems from one single human pair. Period. It's one pair and they're fully human. Against the pre-Adamite theory, first expounded by the Calvinist Isaac de la Peyrère in 1655, and the view of certain modern scientists, according to which the various races are derived from several separated stems, polygenism, the church teaches that the first human beings, Adam and Eve, are the progenitors of the whole human race. This is called monogenism. The teaching of the unity of the human race is not indeed a dogma. but it is a necessary presupposition of the dogma of original sin and redemption. Yeah, we're all... Where did we get our original sin, if not from the original single human pair, right? According to a decision of the Bible Commission, the unity of the human race is to be reckoned among those facts which affect the foundations of the Christian religion, and which, on this account, are to be understood in their literal historical sense. The encyclical Humani Generis of Pius XII, 1950, rejects polygenism on account of its incompatibility with the revealed doctrine of original sin. Biblical proof derives from the narration of the creation, which purports to relate the origin of all things, and therefore also the first emergence of man. Explicit testimonies are Genesis 2:5, which says, quote, "And there was not a man to till the earth," end quote. And Genesis 3:20, which says, quote, "Adam called the name of his wife Eve, because she was the mother of all the living," end quote. And Acts 17:26 says, quote, "And hath made of one all mankind to dwell upon the whole face of the earth," end quote. Compare Wisdom 10:1, Romans 5:12 and following, 1 Corinthians 15:21 and following, and Hebrews 2:11. And also St. Augustine, his works on in Ioan is. We may note that racial differences affect external characteristics only. The essential agreements of all races in physical structure and in mental endowment indicates a common origin. There's one race, the human race, in other words. Section 14. The essential constituent parts of human nature. 1. Two essential constituent parts of man. And here we have a dogma. Man consists of two essential parts, a material body and a spiritual soul. This is a de fide dogma. Man consists of two essential parts, a material body and a spiritual soul. The Fourth Lateran Council and the Vatican Council teach this doctrine. Deinde humanam quasi communem ex spiritu et corpore constituam. In opposition to the teaching of the Church is the exaggerated spiritualism of Plato and of the school of Origen, according to which the body is a burden and a hindrance to the soul. It's prison and grave. In Plato's view, the soul alone makes the man, while the body is only a kind of shadow. The Church teaches, on the contrary, that the body essentially belongs to human nature. The soul is the form of the body. You can't have the body without its form, the soul. When St. Paul speaks in Romans 7:14 and following of a conflict between the body and the soul, and when he longs to be freed from the body of death, Romans 7:24, he is not thinking of the body in its physical construction, but in its condition of moral disorder occasioned by sin. Exactly. Again, incompatible with church dogma is the Trichotomism taught by Plato, the Gnostics, Manichaeans, Apollinarians, and in recent times also by Gunther, according to which man is composed of three essential component parts: the body, an animal soul, and a spiritual soul, which are rendered in Greek as sarx, the flesh. That's where we get sarcophagus from, sarx. Psyche, that's where we get psychic from, or psychology from. And pneuma, that's where we get the word pneumatic, or anything to do with the wind and air and the spirit and the breath. Continuing now, the Eighth General Council of Constantinople from 869 to 870 rejected the doctrine of the two souls and laid down the Catholic dogma that man possesses only one single spiritual soul, unam animam rationabilem et intellectualem habere hominem. One rational and intellectual soul inhabits man. The spiritual soul is the principle of the spiritual mental life and at the same time the principle of the corporeal, that is to say, vegetative and sensitive life. The principle of the spiritual and mental life and at the same time the principle of the corporeal life, which is to say, vegetative and sensitive. According to the teaching of Holy Scripture, man is composed of two essential component parts and will again be resolved into two parts. Genesis 2:7 says, quote, "And the Lord God formed man out of the slime of the earth and breathed in his face the breath of life." Spiraculum vitae is the principle, the life principle of the soul. "And man became a living soul," end quote. Ecclesiastes 12:7 says, quote, "Think of thy Creator before the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the Spirit of God who sent it," end quote. Compare Matthew 10:28 and 1 Corinthians 5:3 and 7:34. The Fathers defend dichotomism, notably against the Christologically false teaching of Apollinaris of Laodicea, founded on Trichotomism. The locution, quote, "spirit and soul," end quote, serves on occasion as a designation of the higher and lower soul life without involving the distinction between two principles. In Holy Writ, the distinction between spirit and soul arises sometimes through the parallelism of Hebraic poetry, for example, Luke 1:46 and following. Speculatively, the uniqueness of the soul principle in man is shown especially by the testimony of the self-consciousness according to which the same person is the principle of the rational as of the sensitive and vegetative activities. Interesting. Number 2, relation of body and soul. And here we have a dogma. The rational soul is per se the essential form of the body. This is a de fide dogma. The rational soul is per se the essential form of the body. Body and soul are connected with each other not merely externally, like a vessel and its contents, a ship and its pilot, see Plato, Descartes, and Leibniz, but as an intrinsic natural unit, body and soul, so that the spiritual soul is of itself and essentially the form of the body. The Council of Vienna, I don't know how you pronounce that, Vienna, I always say Vienna. The Council of Vienna, 1311 to 1312, condemned as heretical. Quod anima rationalis seu intellectiva non sit forma corporis humani per se et essentialiter. Excuse my Latin. The decision was directed against the Franciscan theologian Johannes Olivi, who died in 1298, who taught that the rational soul was not of itself immediately the essential form of the body, but only mediately through the forma sensitiva and vegetativa, which is really distinct from it. This would destroy the essential unity of human nature, replacing it by a dynamic unity of operation. This decision of the Council of Vienna does not imply a dogmatic recognition of the Thomistic teaching of the uniqueness of the substantial form or of the Aristotelian scholastic hylomorphism. I'll say that again. This decision of the Council of Vienna does not imply a dogmatic recognition of the Thomistic teaching of the uniqueness of the substantial form, like Plato's forms, or of the Aristotelian scholastic hylomorphism. Aristotle developed Plato's theory of ideas and forms. And this dogma does not of itself imply a dogmatic recognition of those teachings, okay? According to Genesis 2:7, the slime, by virtue of the creation of the soul, becomes a living human body and thus a component part of human nature. According to the vision of Ezekiel 37:1 and following, the dead members of the body are awakened to life through the spiritual soul. The Fathers conceive the attachment of body and soul as such an intrinsic one that they compare it to the hypostatic union. Wow. Compare the symbol qui cumque, and St. Augustine teaches, quote, "From the soul, the body has feeling and life," end quote. Compare St. John Damascene. References to them there. Continuing now, number 3, individuality and immortality of the soul. And here we have a dogma. Every human being possesses an individual soul. This is a de fide dogma. Every human being possesses an individual soul. The Fifth General Lateran Council, which ran from 1512 to 1517, denounced the humanistic Neoplatonists, and we have as an example Pietro Pomponazzi, who espoused Averroistic monopsychism. Averroes, or whatever his name was an Arabic philosopher. Quite a genius, too. So the Fifth Lateran Council denounced the humanistic Neoplatonists who espoused this monopsychism, declaring that the rational soul in all men is numerically one unique principle, and that only this general soul is immortal. Damnamus et reprobamus omnes asserentes animam intellectivam mortalam esse aut unicam in cunctis hominibus. We condemn and reprove all who maintain that the rational soul is mortal or one unique reality shared in by every man. That's condemned. The individuality of each soul is an essential presupposition of personal immortality. Obviously, we're not going to go back as it drops into the ocean and just merge with some kind of blasé being from the one soul. We have personal immortality. The soul will not be destroyed in all eternity by decree of God. The idea of retribution in this world appears strongly in the Old Testament, yet even the oldest of its books profess, against the assertion of rationalistic criticism, a belief in immortality. According to the view of Holy Writ, life on earth is an exile in a foreign land. See Genesis 47:9, for example. The deceased go to their fathers, as the saying goes in Genesis 15:15, are gathered to their people. See Genesis 25:8-17. Sleep in their fathers. Deuteronomy 31:16, 3 Kings 2:10. After death, the soul enters the Sheol, that is, a place of collective detention of the departed souls. See Genesis 37:35. The newer books, especially the Book of Wisdom, are rich in testimonies of the belief in immortality held by the people of Israel. Compare especially Wisdom 2:23, which says, quote, "For God created man incorruptible, and to the image of his own eternity he made him," end quote. According to another reading, quote, "to the image of his own being," end quote. The firm belief in the other world expressed in the New Testament rests on the conviction of personal immortality. Jesus teaches, fear ye not them that kill the body and are not able to kill the soul. Jesus teaches, quote, "Fear ye not them that kill the body and are not able to kill the soul," end quote. Matthew 10:28. Quote, "These shall go into everlasting punishment, but the just into eternal life," end quote. Matthew 25:46. St. Paul believes that he will be united with Christ immediately after his death, and not only after the resurrection. He says, quote, but I am straitened between two, having a desire to be dissolved and to be with Christ," end quote. That from Philippians 1:23. The doctrine of the death of the soul, Trichotomism, is unknown in the New Testament. So the false doctrine of the death of the soul is unknown. This Trichotomism. Nowhere to be found. The passage Ecclesiastes 3:21 says, quote, "Who knoweth if the spirit of the children of Adam ascend upward, and if the spirit of the beasts descend downward," end quote, appears to cast doubt on immortality. However, according to the context, it refers only to the animal side of man, which is like the animal mortal. The immortality of the soul is proved beyond all doubt by other passages of the book. Compare chapter 12, verse 7 and chapter 9, verse 10. The Fathers not merely unanimously assert the doctrine of immortality, but also establish it philosophically. Origen defends it against Netopsychism, which was widely current in Arabia. St. Gregory of Nyssa treats it from the philosophic standpoint in his Dialogos de Anima et Resurrectione, as does St. Augustine in his monograph De Immortalitate Animae. Natural reason proves the immortality of the soul from its physical simplicity. As it is not composed of parts, it cannot be resolved into parts. God could, it is true, annihilate the soul, but his wisdom and goodness demand that he should not frustrate the connatural desire of the soul for truth and bliss in the other world, just as his justice demands that he rewards the good and punish the wicked in the other world. But he rewards, little note here, he rewards the good more than they deserve, and he punishes the wicked less than they deserve. Interesting. I mean, it's important to remember that fact about God and his justice and mercy and goodness. Everything looks good. Okay, moving on now. Section 15, the origin of individual human souls. In the posterity of Adam, the origin of the soul is associated with natural generation. As to the mode and manner of the origin of the soul, different opinions have been advanced. 1. Pre-existentialism. Pre-existentianism, which was proposed by Plato and which in the early Christian era was accepted by Origen and individual members of his disciples. For example, Didymus of Alexandria, Evagrius, Ponticus, Nemesius of Emesa, names that roll off the tongue, as well as by the Priscillianists, teaches that souls exist even before their connection with the bodies, according to Plato and Origen, from all eternity, and are exiled in bodies as a punishment for moral defect. This doctrine was rejected by a synod at Constantinople in 543 against the Origenists, and by a synod at Braga in 561 against the Priscillianists. The idea of a pre-existence of the soul and of a pre-corporeal fall through sin is unknown to Holy Writ. Again, the passage Wisdom 8:19 and following says, quote, "And I was a witty child and had received a good soul. And whereas I was more good, I came into a body undefiled," end quote, is not to be understood in the sense of the Platonic doctrine of pre-existence, as the anthropological conceptions of the Book of Wisdom are entirely different from those of Plato. According to the testimony of Holy Writ, the first man created by God was good in soul and body. Genesis 1:31. Sin entered the world through the fall by sin of our first parents. Genesis 3:1 and following, Romans 5:12. St. Paul in Romans 9:11 directly excluded a pre-corporeal fall through sin. He says, quote, "For when the children were not yet born, nor yet had done any good or evil," end quote. The Fathers, with very few exceptions, are opponents of the doctrine of pre-existence upheld by Origen. Compare St. Gregory Nazianzus, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Augustine, Leo I. The testimony of self-consciousness testifies against the pre-existence of the soul. 2. Emanationism. Eminentism, which was represented in antiquity by Gnostic Manichaean dualism and which in modern times is taught by pantheism, teaches that individual souls proceed by emanation or an outflowing from the divine substance. The teaching contradicts the absolute simplicity of God. It was rejected by the Vatican Council together with pantheism as heretical. St. Augustine says, quote, "The soul is not a part of God, for if it were, then it would be in every respect unchangeable and indestructible," end quote. 3. Generationism. Generationism traces the origin of the human soul, as well as the origin of the body, back to the act of generation performed by the parents. According to it, parents are the originators of both body and soul. The cruder form of generationism, that is the traducianism expounded by Tertullian, teaches that with the corporeal semen, a part of the soul substance of the parents, tradux, is transmitted to the child. A less crude form of generationism, which was held by St. Augustine to be possible, and in the past century by Klee, Rosmini, and others to be probable, holds fast to the spirituality of the soul and makes the soul of the child emerge from a semen spirituale of the parents. So not a physical semen, but a spiritual semen. Generationism is incompatible with the simplicity and spirituality of the soul. Pope Benedict XII demanded the condemnation of the doctrine of generationism as a precondition of the union from the Armenians, 1341. Leo XIII condemned the teaching of Rosmini. Number 4, creationism. Here we have a dogma. Every individual soul was immediately created out of nothing by God. It's a sent certa dogma. Every individual soul was created immediately by God, out of nothing. Creationism, taught by the vast majority of the fathers, by the schoolmen, and by modern theology, holds that each individual soul is created by God out of nothing at the moment of its unification with the body. This doctrine is not defined. It is, however, indirectly expressed in the decision of faith of the Fifth General Lateran Council. Pope Alexander VII, in a doctrinal assertion on the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which formed the basis of the dogmatic definition of Pius IX, speaks of the, quote, creation and infusion, unquote, of her soul into the body. Pope Pius XII, in the encyclical Humani Generis, teaches, quote, the Catholic faith obliges us to hold firmly that souls are immediately created by God, end quote. A stringent scriptural proof of the doctrine of creationism is not possible. However, it is intimated in Ecclesiastes 12:7, which says, quote, the spirit returns to God who gave it, end quote. Wisdom 15:11, inspiration of the soul through God, and Hebrews 12:9, distinction between the fathers of the flesh and the Father, capital F, Father of the spirits, meaning God. Most of the fathers, especially the Greek, are adherents of creationism. While St. Jerome decisively advocates creationism, St. Augustine wavered all his life between generationism and creationism. Difficulty of reconciling the immediate creation of the soul by God with the handing on of original sin held him back from a decisive confession of creationism. In the following centuries, under the influence of St. Augustine, a certain indecision continued up to the period of the peak of scholasticism, when creationism found a general recognition. St. Thomas went so far as to condemn generationism as heretical, and the reference is given to the Summa there. So, to err is human, to forgive divine. I have no problem that St. Augustine erred, was hesitating with his creationism because he had, he's only human. He's not infallible when teaching faith and morals, except when, as a bishop, he was participating in those means of his office that protected him from teaching error concerning faith and morals. But in his writings, his personal writings, he's not protected in that way. The time of the creation and infusion of the soul. According to the Aristotelian scholastic viewpoint, in the human embryo, 3 different forms of life follow one another in point of time, in such a manner that the following form at any time takes place, in such a manner that the following form at any time takes over the functions of the preceding, namely the vegetative, the sensitive, and finally, after 40 or mutatis mutandis, 80 days, the spiritual. From this derives the distinction between the fetus informis and fetus formatus. Confirmation of this was sought in Exodus 21:22 and following, according to the Septuagint and the Old Latin translation. The fetus informis was regarded as being purely animal, God forbid. The fetus formatus, a human being, the destruction of which was regarded as murder. Well, you can't even destroy the single cell, the zygote. That's murder too. Modern Christian philosophy generally holds that the creation and infusion of the spiritual soul coincides with the moment of conception. Yes. That's obvious, I think. I think we can know that by the light of natural reason. The elevation of man to the supernatural order. So we're continuing now with 2, the elevation of man to the supernatural order. A glass of water here. Section 16, the concept of the supernatural. 1. Determination of the concept. Natural, in opposition to supernatural, is that which is either part of nature or that which proceeds out of nature as its effect, or to which nature has a claim. The natural order is the ordination of all creatures to their ultimate end in accordance with their nature. I'll read that again. The natural order is the ordination of all creatures to their ultimate end in accordance with their nature. St. Augustine employs the word natural in accord with its etymology. Natura equals nascitura, frequently in the sense of original, originalis, and on occasion in the sense of according to nature, conveniens. The natural endowment of man in the sense of St. Augustine includes also the supernatural gifts of the primitive state. So we talk about what's natural for man is not to be in the fallen state, but to be in the primitive state with all the gifts that we had. Supernatural is that which is neither a part of nature nor proceeds as effect from nature, nor can be claimed by nature, but which transcends the being, the powers, and the claims of nature. It transcends the being, the powers, and the claims of nature. The supernatural is superadded by God over the claims and endowments of nature to the natural gifts of the creature. The supernatural order is the ordination of rational creatures to a supernatural final goal. 2. Division. The supernatural is divided into A, the supernatural in substance, and the supernatural in mode. The supernatural in substance is that which by its intrinsic character transcends the nature of the creature. For example, our knowledge of the triune personality of God, actual grace, sanctifying grace, the immediate vision of God. Supernatural in mode is an effect which as to its essence is indeed natural, but which in the mode and manner of its production transcends the natural powers of the creature. For example, a miraculous healing of a sick person. So that's supernatural in mode. B, the absolutely supernatural, or the supernatural pure and simple, and the relatively supernatural. This is another distinction, or the supernatural in a definite respect. The absolutely supernatural connotes goods of the divine order which transcend the nature of creatures. For example, sanctifying grace, or the immediate vision of God. The relatively supernatural connotes goods of the created order, which, though supernatural for one creature, are not supernatural for another creature. For example, infused knowledge, which is natural for the angels, and supernatural for human beings. To the relatively supernatural belong the so-called preternatural gifts of man's primitive state. So the preternatural gifts of man's primitive state are supernatural in a relative way. They're called relatively supernatural. Interesting. Moving on, section 17, relation between nature and supernature. 1, nature's capacity to receive a supernature. And here we have a dogma. A creature has the capacity to receive supernatural gifts. It's a cent communis grade of certainty on this dogma. A creature has the capacity to receive supernatural gifts. Though the supernatural is beyond nature, still nature has a certain receptivity for the supernatural, the so-called potentia obedientialis, obedientialis. Potentia obedientialis, I'll say. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but my Latin is horrible. A certain receptivity for the supernatural. This is the passive potentiality proper to creatures of being elevated by the Creator to a supernatural state of being and activity. You can see the summa for that. According to the schoolman, the supernatural gift is educed through the power of the Creator from the potentia obedientialis. In other words, the passive potentiality which is present in the nature of the creature is actualized by the omnipotence of God. This doctrine is essentially different from the modernistic teaching of the quote-unquote vital immanence, according to which everything religious develops out of the necessities of human nature in a purely natural fashion. So that's not what we're talking about here. The St. Augustine teaches, Posse habere fidem sicut posse habere caritatem naturae est hominum, habere autem fidem quamad modum habere caritatem gratia est fidelium. I won't bother trying to translate that. 2. Organic connection of nature and supernature. And here we have a dogma. A. The supernatural presupposes nature. This is a Cent Communis dogma. The supernatural presupposes nature. The supernatural does not exist in itself, but in something else. It is therefore not a substance, but an accident. Thus, the supernatural presupposes a created nature, which receives it and in which it operates. Yeah, what's a supernatural means above the natural. Above the what? Above the natural. So it presupposes the natural, which itself is above. B, the supernatural perfects nature. This is another dogma, Cent Communis dogma. The supernatural perfects nature. The supernatural is not superadded merely externally to nature, but affects nature intrinsically. It permeates the being and the powers of nature and perfects it either within the created order, for example, the preternatural gifts, or through elevation into the divine order of being and activity. Absolutely supernatural gifts. The fathers and theologians compare the supernatural to fire, which makes iron glow, or to a plant which is grafted on a tree. 3. The natural and supernatural aim of man. And here we have another dogma. God has conferred on man a supernatural destiny. This is a de fide dogma. God has conferred on man a supernatural destiny. Take that, you evolutionists, Darwinists. We have a supernatural destiny. The Vatican Council establishes the absolute necessity of revelation by reason of man's ordination to a supernatural final end. Man's final end consists in a participation by him in God's vision of himself. The attainment of this end by man gives glory to God and fills men with supernatural happiness. And we can compare 1 Corinthians 13:12 and 1 John 3:2. And for more on this, see the Doctrine of God, paragraph 6. The natural end of man, which consists in man's natural knowledge and love of God, and in the natural glorification of God, is subordinated and adapted to his supernatural end. The natural order is thus used as a means for the attaining of the ultimate supernatural goal. Man, by reason of his whole dependence on God, is bound to strive after the supernatural destination determined for him by God. If he neglects this, then he cannot reach the natural goal either. Right? Makes sense. Moving on, section 18, the supernatural endowment of the first man. 1. Sanctifying grace. And here we have a dogma. Our first parents before the fall were endowed with sanctifying grace. That's a de fide dogma. Our first parents before the fall were endowed with sanctifying grace. The Council of Trent, in opposition to Pelagianism and to modern rationalism, teaches, if anyone will not confess that when the first man, Adam, had transgressed the mandate of God in paradise, He did not immediately lose the sanctity and justice in which he had been constituted. Anathema sit. End quote. Against Bias and the Jansenist Canel, the Church asserted the supernatural character of the gifts given to man in the primitive state. We have lots of references to Denzinger there, too. The elevation to the state of grace is indicated by the intimacy between God and the progenitors of the human race in paradise. A scriptural proof is provided by St. Paul's teaching on the redemption. The apostle teaches that Christ, the second Adam, restored what the first Adam had lost, the state of holiness and justice. But if he had lost it, he must previously have received it. And here we have all kinds of biblical references. You're free to look those up at your leisure. The fathers find the supernatural endowment with grace indicated in Genesis 1:26, Genesis 2:7, Ecclesiastes 7:30, which says, only, quote, only this have I found, that God made man right. End quote. St. Augustine declares that our renewal, see Ephesians 4:23, consists in this, that, quote, we have received justice from which man had fallen off through sin, end quote. St. John Damascene says, quote, the Creator has communicated his divine grace to man and thereby made him a participant in his community, end quote. As regards the time of man's elevation to the state of grace, most theologians, including St. Thomas and his school, are of the opinion that the first men were created in the state of sanctifying grace. Petrus Lombardus and the Franciscan school, on the other hand, teach that the first human beings on their creation received only the preternatural gifts of integrity and were required to prepare themselves with the help of actual grace for the reception of sanctifying grace. Okay, well, I mean, I would have to go with Thomas on this one. I think we were created in the state of sanctifying grace. But God only knows. The Council of Trent has deliberately left the question undecided. St. Thomas's teaching is that of the fathers. So it seems like St. Thomas has the fathers on his side. 2. The gifts of integrity. The supernatural endowment of the first men, Justia Originalis, included, in addition to the absolute supernatural gift of sanctifying grace, certain preternatural gifts, the so-called dona integritatis. And here we have a dogma. A. The donum rectitudinis or integritatis in the narrower sense, i.e. the freedom from irregular desire. This is a Sent Fide Proxima dogma. So the supernatural endowment of the first man included the donum rectitudinis or the donum integritatis in the narrower sense. That is to say, the freedom from irregular desire. So this dogma could be stated simply as the supernatural endowment of the first men included the freedom from irregular desire, or what I would call concupiscence. The Council of Trent explains that concupiscence, there it is. The Council of Trent explains that concupiscence was called a sin by St. Paul because it flows from sin and makes one inclined to sin. In Latin, quia ex peccato est ex ad peccatum inclinat. Quia ex peccato est et ad peccatum inclinat. But if it does flow from sin, then it did not exist before sin. Yeah. Good point. Concupiscence comes from sin. That's why we have the mystery of iniquity. How did Satan fall? How did Adam and Eve fall before sin? How did they fall? Right? Pride. So I must have been reaching for some good that was above their station. Holy Writ attests the perfect harmony between reason and sensuality. Genesis 2:25 says, quote, And they were both naked and were not ashamed, end quote. It was only sin that gave rise to the feeling of shame. See Genesis 3, 7, and 10. The fathers defend the donum integritatis against the Pelagians, who regarded concupiscence not as a defect of nature, but as a power of nature. St. Augustine teaches that the first man, by reason of the gift of integrity, had the possibility of easily avoiding sin. Posse non peccare. And here we have another dogma. B. The donum immortalitatis, that is to say, bodily immortality. This is another gift. The supernatural endowment of the first men included B. The donum immortalitatis, which is to say, bodily immortality. This is a de fide dogma. The Council of Trent teaches that Adam fell under the sentence of death as a punishment for sin. Holy Writ records that God threatened and imposed death as punishment for the transgression of his probationary commandment. Genesis 2:17, 3:19, and compare Wisdom 1:13, which says, quote, "For God made not death," end quote. Wisdom 2:24 says, quote, "But by the envy of the devil, death came into the world," end quote. And Romans 5:12 says, quote, "By one man, sin entered into the world, and by sin, death," end quote. The gift of immortality is, as St. Augustine teaches, to be conceived as posse non more, the possibility of not dying, not as non posse more, the impossibility of dying. Fathers regarded bodily immortality as being transmitted through the tree of life. Genesis 2:9 and 3:22. And here we have another dogma. The supernatural endowment of the first men included C. The donum impassibilitatis, that is, the freedom from suffering. This is a Cent Communis dogma. So we had the freedom from suffering. This gift is to be more closely defined as posse non pati, the possibility of remaining free from suffering. It is associated with corporeal immortality. Holy Writ presents suffering and sorrow as the consequences of sin. Exactly. Genesis 3:16 and following. Before sin came into the world, the progenitors of the human race lived in a condition of unalloyed happiness. Of course. Compare Genesis 2:15, which says, "In paradiso voluptatis." But freedom from suffering in no wise means inactivity. Our first parents, immediately after their creation by God, received from him the order to till the land. See Genesis 2:15. And thus, in a limited measure, to participate in the work of the Creator. And here we have another dogma, another gift. The supernatural endowment of the first men included D. The donum scientiae, that is, a knowledge of natural and supernatural truths infused by God. This is Cent Communis dogma. So the supernatural gifts of the first man included the donum scientiae, which is a knowledge of natural and supernatural truths infused by God. Since our first parents, according to Holy Writ, entered into existence in an adult state, boom, and were the first teachers and educators of humanity, it was appropriate that they should be equipped by God with a natural knowledge suitable to their age and their tasks, and with that measure of supernatural knowledge which was necessary to enable them to achieve their supernatural destiny. In Holy Writ, the deep knowledge of Adam is indicated in his naming of the animals, see Genesis 2:20, and in his immediate knowledge of the status and tasks of the woman, see Genesis 2:23 and following. And the status and tasks of the woman do differ Whether you like it or not, they do differ from that of the man. In Genesis 2:20, the naming of the animals, St. Augustine sees, quote, a proof of the transcendental wisdom, unquote. According to St. Cyril of Alexandria, quote, Adam, the head of the race, was perfect in knowledge immediately from the first moment of his emergence, end quote. Perfect in knowledge. Perfect in knowledge. Talk to a theistic evolution about Adam and his knowledge, and you will readily see that they believe that he was a dimwit. Okay? The theistic evolutionists today believe that Adam was a dimwit. 3. The gifts of the primitive state as hereditary gifts. Here we have a dogma. Adam received sanctifying grace not merely for himself, but for all his posterity. This is a censored dogma. Adam received sanctifying grace not merely for himself, but for all his posterity. The Council of Trent teaches that Adam lost sanctity and justice, meaning sanctifying grace, not merely for himself, but also for us. It follows from this that he received these not only for himself, but also for us, his descendants. This, according to the unanimous teaching of the fathers and of the theologians, applies to the preternatural gifts of integrity, with the exception of the donum scientiae. For these were bestowed for the sake of sanctifying grace. Adam received the gifts of the original state not as an individual person, but as head of the human race, and thus for the whole human race. They were a present to human nature, donum naturae, and according to the positive ordinance of God were to be transmitted with nature to all the heirs of that nature. Original justice was intended to be hereditary justice. The fathers declare that we, the posterity of Adam, received the grace of God gratuitously and lost it through sin. This manner of speaking presupposes that the original endowment with grace ought to pass from Adam to his posterity. Compare St. Basil, who says, quote, let us return to the original grace of which we were deprived by sin, end quote. See also St. Augustine, and you can look up those references there. Section 19, the various states of human nature. By the state of human nature, status naturae humanae, is understood the inner constitution of human nature in relation to the final goal set for it by God. One distinguishes between historical or real and merely possible states. 1. Real states. A. The state of elevated nature. That is the primitive state of the first human beings before the fall through sin, in which they possessed both the absolute supernatural gifts of sanctifying grace as well as the preternatural gifts of integrity. B. The state of fallen nature. That is the state following immediately after the sin of Adam, in which man, as punishment for sin, possessed neither sanctifying grace nor the gifts of integrity. And C. The state of restored nature. That is the condition of those who have achieved their supernatural destiny, i.e., the immediate vision of God. This state includes in its perfection sanctifying grace. After the resurrection, the body of those in this state will also be endowed with the preternatural gifts of integrity. Non posse peccare, non posse more, non posse pati. Can't sin, can't die, can't suffer. Common to all real states is the possession of the beatific vision of God, which is our supernatural end. 2. Merely possible states. A. The state of pure nature. That is a condition in which man would possess all that and only that which appertains to human nature, and in which he would attain to a natural final end only. The possibility of a pure state of nature, which was denied by Luther, Bius, and Jansenius, is certain church doctrine. It springs as a necessary consequence from the doctrine of the supernatural character of the gifts of the primitive state. Pope Pius V rejected the assertion of Bius. Deus non potuisset ab initio talem creare hominem qualis nunt nascitur. Not sure what that means, but it was condemned, or rejected rather, by Pope Pius V. The Church teaches, therefore, that God could have created man without supernatural or preternatural gifts, but not in a condition of sin. St. Augustine and the schoolmen expressly teach the possibility of the pure state of nature. And you can compare St. Augustine's retractions and St. Thomas, the references are given there. D, the state of unimpaired nature. That is a condition in which man, in addition to his nature, would possess the preternatural gifts of integrity in order to reach his natural final goal with ease and with certainty. So I wonder if they're priming us for the doctrine of limbo, because there's a sort of different kind of paradise, earthly paradise, for those who die, the children who die before the age of reason without being baptized. I think it's a good time to stop here. We are about an hour in, so we'll continue next time. I'll just take note here where we've done section item 19 and going on to 20. So today, episode 9, we covered items 13 through 19. Not today, because today I did 6, 7, 8, and 9. Well, yesterday I did 6, today I did episode 7, 8, and 9. So I covered a lot of ground this weekend. I want to get through this book. Currently, if I can show my progress here. I'm that far in this little portion here I've read. So I've read 106 pages out of 544. 106 out of 544. 20%. 19.4%. So I'll leave it there, and I guess I'm done for today. I'm done for this weekend. Hopefully I'll burn through some more next weekend. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk very soon. God bless.